One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is because underlying your recent experience with COVID and this long COVID experience, you have a history of endometriosis. So, for anyone who's listening who has a history of a chronic illness like endometriosis, autoimmune disease, other post viral fatigues, or in issues like Lyme or fibromyalgia or CFS, listen in if you're working with these women or you're struggling with this yourself, because this underlying chronic condition sets us up for some vulnerability. Welcome back. I'm here with Aurelie. She is one of our brilliant students and graduates, actually, at the Integrative Women's Health Institute. She's a women's health coach. So let's start with a little bit of history. So one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to kind of showcase some of how we do this work is because underlying your recent experience with COVID and this long COVID experience, you have a history of endometriosis. So for anyone who's listening who has a history of a chronic illness like endometriosis, autoimmune disease, other post-viral fatigues, or in issues like Lyme or fibromyalgia or ME/CFS, listen in if you're working with these women or you're struggling with this yourself, because this underlying chronic condition sets us up for some vulnerability. So share with everyone kind of how your health journey has been up until the last couple months.
Yes, so I think it started in 2013. I had no history of pain during, my cycle, and during the summer I got, immense pain during my period, and I had to go to the emergency, and I'm not the kind of person, to go there, and they didn't find anything, but I had to see a gynecologist because I had this conscious also and this body awareness about something related to my period, but it was not a specialist at this time, and so I did a lot of researches, and at that time we didn't have so much information as we have, today. But I found, the word endometriosis, and I thought, okay, so maybe, I would check for this. And I was really lucky because I got a diagnosis, in 6 months.
Mhm.
And we know it takes 7 to 10 years to have a diagnosis. So I was pretty lucky, and I decided to implement things that I knew, and it was really helpful. So with nutrition, with also yoga, more therapeutic yoga, that I have adapted, and other stuff, and I was able to manage my pain, and I was really fine. So at that time also, I had a new job, and I started a new job, an MBA, and I think that my vision also of enjoying, this part of my life helped also a lot, in the process. And then, so I had my annual check, and, it was fine. And it was at the end of 2022, in September, I got the COVID, for the first time. And after that, I felt that something was off. So I consulted, my GP, and she told me, no, it's fine, but something was off. And I started to have all weird and, symptoms, and especially with my right hand. So it was blue and with things on my skin, and it was swollen. And so I consulted, and they said, yeah, okay, maybe that's an allergy or something. I said, I'm not sure. And I got also some, hematoma, so on my skin.
Mm-hmm.
and also during the night. So I woke up and I could see, these things on my skin. And I started also to have dysautonomia from a seated position to a standing position. I got, dizziness and a lot of fatigue. And I was not able to, to have the kind of physical activity or body work that I had before. And even going outside and to do some, shopping, it was like, okay, the big highlight of the day. And also I had some cognition also issues. So
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't talk maybe more than 20 minutes in a call or focus on the work more than 20 minutes. And I had to sleep. So I had to take a nap. I was totally exhausted. And I thought at the time, yeah, that's maybe because I had a lot, because I was preparing, my move and to Asia and it was not, planned, and I didn't want to move. So it was a lot of stress at the time. And then, so I came here and also with my hand. So it was still really swollen and blue.
And just
And
one hand or both?
it was one hand. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why it was quite surprising to me. I
Mm-hmm.
used to have, it's called in French syndrome de Raynaud,
Oh,
Raynaud syndrome.
Raynaud's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I used to have that, when I was a student, but then it was okay. And at first I thought, okay, maybe that's that. I was not sure.
Mm.
And then, so when I arrived, I took also my blood pressure because I had this dizziness and big
Mm-hmm.
fatigue, and also my heart rate was really lower than it was. And I was afraid that, I had a clot or something. And, and with the plane and with the travel, I thought, okay, I have to check. And we did an ultrasound, of the veins and
Essentially in
fingers,
your arm and
yeah,
hand.
arms,
Uh-huh.
and also, the neck, and it was fine. And I said, always, no, it's not fine. Something is off, and my blood pressure is down, and
Yeah.
my heart rate also. I have dizziness. I have these weird things and this fatigue, and but I explained at that time, yeah, to myself, yeah, maybe it can be also because of the move, because it was a stressful event. I had also, I had to leave, my home, my family, my friends, and to close my business. And I thought, okay, all is new. It was a lot of stress. It can explain also the fatigue and so on. It's a new place, new environment, new food, new hair, all kind of things. And my
Mm-hmm.
body, yeah, will adapt. But it didn't, go away. And one day also you told me, yeah, it can be, long COVID because of dysautonomia and things, or maybe also perimenopause because I'm
Mm-hmm.
45. And, but I thought, yeah, maybe, yeah, that's because all is new, my body, need time to adapt. And, but no, it went not so much better. And now it's, yeah, getting better, but I still have this, fatigue after, a long day, or if I have a long walk, or after exercising, or, even, working on the computer. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's so interesting. And I think I want to point out a few key features here.
Mm-hmm.
So, one is that you have this underlying history of endometriosis that you were diagnosed with back in 2013. So that's like 11 years ago. And at the time, you well controlled your endometriosis with nutrition, with lifestyle. Your symptoms were well managed. Your period pelvic pain was well managed. Any symptoms, like, did you ever have a surgery for endometriosis, or you just managed it
No,
with, okay, so you just managed it with
no,
integrative perspective? Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Did you take any medications for the endometriosis? No.
no.
Okay, great. So you had a very stable case of endometriosis. Now, one thing that we're seeing, interestingly, and I spoke about this on our episodes with Sally Serrell and a little bit with Ginger Garner, also more about the gaslighting, the medical
Mm.
gaslighting that you experience. You're fine. You're fine. But I think you have seemed to have experienced the perfect storm that I'm seeing some elements of amongst almost everyone in my practice with a version of long COVID. And that is, okay, so you have this very stable and well managed underlying condition. But with endometriosis, independent of long COVID, we're also seeing that endometriosis can shift or progress or get worse or change, certainly with a stressful event that could always happen, but also with the hormonal shifts of perimenopause. And sometimes it's not even expressed until perimenopause. The data is that around 14 to 15% of women are actually who are in perimenopause are diagnosed with endometriosis then, which is actually a higher rate than the average rate of endometriosis, which is 10%. So the perfect storm of things that happen then. So you're all good. You have endometriosis, but you're doing all the things. Your nutrition, you have a really solid yoga practice, your nervous system is regulated, you're moving, you have work that you love, you're connected with your family, with your friends, you're comfortable in your home, the place you've always lived. And then in September of 2022, you get COVID, and that was your first COVID infection. Have you had any other COVID infections?
No, not that
Okay.
I know.
Okay. And any COVID vaccinations?
I had. And
Before or
after,
after?
it was before.
When was the vaccine? Like 2021
Uh,
sometime?
yeah, I don't
Okay.
remember exactly. And I noticed also a change in my period.
Okay.
I got some pain, and
You
I
had
got
some pain
also
with the
pain
period. Okay.
and more bleeding during the
Okay.
period.
So you had vaccines sometime in 2021. You started
Yes,
getting these sort of splotchy redness, potentially
yes,
hematomas throughout your skin.
yes.
And you started having changes in your period, heavier flow, more pain, consistent cycles, or changes in the timing of the cycles.
I noticed a change, but after maybe 2 to 3 months, it was stable again.
Okay. So it was
Yeah,
kind of this temporary shakeup of
exactly.
your immune and endocrine systems, if you will, and
Yeah,
maybe vascular even then at the time. So, and again, so at that time you were about 43.
yeah.
Okay. So also again, perimenopause, which makes it so complicated. One of the like red flags I'm seeing, just clinical pearl here, is that when women are in the lower estrogen state, we do have data that puts them at higher risk for complications from COVID. So the challenge with perimenopause is we never really know if we're in a low estrogen state or an estrogen dominant state or a declining estrogen state. It's kind of all over the place. So it could just be a matter of timing. I've seen multiple times in my practice where like someone has had two COVID infections, were fine, had vaccine, was fine. And then on their like third infection, maybe was during the luteal phase. And that's when the long COVID hit. So I do think
Mm.
there's this interesting protection that estrogen may provide. So the research supports it at some level, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, but there's also, I think, more to that story. All right. So you have your first infection September of 2022. You're also perimenopausal, and then you're also making a major international move that requires you to do stuff that you don't want to do, moves you away from your support network. And it's a pretty stressful experience. So when was that move?
It was in March 2023,
Okay.
but I had to do another move because I was in another country. So it was, in fact, yeah, two moves.
It
and
was two moves. Yeah.
yeah, and I tried also, to rule perimenopause out in a way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I asked also for some, blood testing just to have a snapshot. I know that hormones can, fluctuate. And it was surprising because my testosterone level, it was really, really low, almost zero. And
Mm.
I thought, yeah, that's interesting, but I didn't know what to do with that. And when I listened also to my clients who are, in the transition into menopause, it seemed that on the paper, I could have, some of the symptoms or similar symptoms, but the feeling that I had, it was not that.
Yeah. So when you did the snapshot of your hormones, as we know, it's a moment in time, but it's still valuable. Was your estrogen and progesterone normal?
They were.
Okay. That's good to know.
Yeah.
So you had relatively, well, quite low testosterone, but normal estrogen, progesterone. You're now roughly 44, 45 years old, and you're kind of experiencing perimenopause. And this is where I think it gets very complicated from a long
Mm-hmm.
COVID standpoint. So the differences that I see, and I think you're probably seeing these with your clients too, is that in perimenopause, menopause, yes, we have the sleep disturbance, but we don't always have this like intense fatigue. That's a real hallmark of the post-viral syndrome, the needing to take a nap but not be restorative, symptoms worsening with activity, which is why pacing is so valuable, kind of slowly increasing our levels without pushing too far past that envelope too often. And then the other really like blaring, flashing light for me is this experience that you had of all these vascular
Mm-hmm.
symptoms and the dysautonomia, the blood pressure and heart rate being up and down, the dizziness, heat intolerance, which is really tough when you move to a country that's much hotter. So those are different. Like I don't tend to generally see women in just
Mm-hmm.
normal perimenopause transition have such extreme dysautonomia and vascular warning signs. Now we do know that the menopause transition does increase people's cardiovascular risk, but it's usually a bit more subtle. Like we're not seeing hematomas everywhere, we're not seeing blue hands, we're seeing things like um, elevated cholesterol, kind of out of nowhere, weight loss resistance in the abdominal area, especially. Things like that. So these things can coexist with long COVID, but I think the hallmarks that you're presenting of long COVID are the dysautonomia, the heat intolerance, the vascular changes, even if you don't have an actual blood clot, which is good news. But we also know from the literature around long COVID that microclotting, which is little tiny
Mm-hmm.
blood clots in the capillaries, is one of the potentially key drivers of long COVID. The question is why? Is there still infection? Is it a change to the immune system? That the research has not yet fully elucidated, but it does seem like with long COVID, kind of like with chronic Lyme or chronic EBV, there's this sort of continuation, this persistent viral infection that's going on. All right. So your infection was September of 2022. You had a bunch of kind of like you had a big move in March of 23. You started to get oriented to your new health system. And you had a lot of serious issues ruled out, such as a blood clot or, so we have a 7-step system around here where, as you know, we kind of walk through a coaching led path. So we've heard your story, which is essentially step 3, but let's back up to step 1 a bit. where in step one, even within our sessions here, and hopefully you're feeling this way now, although it's a little bit unusual that we're filming this, but we're, and you're very aware of this because of your yoga background and your ability to track autonomic nervous system and your breath work background in meditation. Clearly, you were living in kind of a fight or flight. There's sort of three different states that people can be in, and it's a bit of a continuum. So 10 is like chronic fight or flight, anxious, wired and tired, all of that. 5 is where we want to live. That's the rest and digest, calm aliveness, a feeling of peace, but also that cognitive engagement is possible. There's energy. That's kind of where you were knocked out of, but know what that feels like because you spent 10 years living there when you were really working on your yoga practice and you were working on optimizing your health from the endometriosis diagnosis. So you know what that feels like. And then there's 0 on the continuum, which is like the freeze state. And that's where you just kind of get overwhelmed, panicked, but in a way that's just paralyzing, sleeping kind of, or just checking out, scrolling, but not really being restorative. So where have you been living, say, for the past 6 months in terms of your autonomic nervous system?
I think, yeah, it was between the freeze, state and fight and fly. And just at the beginning, of this year, I started to come back, in the middle. And that it's, I felt, it was weird, to have all the foundation in place and still have, this feeling of, anxiety, panic attack, nervous system, dysregulation and other things. It was, I couldn't explain,
Yeah. And I really appreciate you sharing that because I think there is some conversation in the world of integrative health that you won't be knocked out by COVID if you have a strong foundation of autonomic nervous system regulation. But I was the same as you. I was doing a lot of yoga. I was meditating every day. And it took me about a year to resettle my nervous system despite using those tools. And it sounds like it took you roughly the same amount of time.
Yeah.
And so I think the good news about that is that having that foundation helps because so if you're feeling perfectly well right now, you're listening to this as a practitioner, not a person living with this or a caregiver or anything else. Life can knock you off balance, whether it's this infection or something else. And it might take a while to come back to that baseline, depending on how severe of a knock you get. But I've seen this time and time again, and it's been people who have been vaccinated, not vaccinated ever, had 1 COVID infection, had 5 COVID infections, had a combination of both. Even people in the integrative health space that I've worked with in my practice, yoga professionals, functional medicine practitioners, therapists, manual therapists, I have seen time and time again, no matter what the circumstance, that this key nervous system regulation piece is very surprising to them about how problematic even just 1 COVID infection could be for someone who had a really strong foundation, just like you. We're eating all the perfect things. Maybe they got vaccinated, maybe they didn't. I've seen cases of absolutely of both, the exact same circumstance. That sense of having anxiety, that sense of feeling stuck. So that's the bad news. But the good news, you can do all the right things and still be really knocked on your butt by this. You really can. And having that foundation is still so valuable because you're seeing now a year later. And I think that's the other reason to wear a trackable wearable device, tracking your HRV. You use an Oura ring, use a Garmin. I have one somewhere over here, but it's just a little watch. And if you have yours, you can show it for,
I have it
if not,
here.
yeah.
Just here.
Oh
I
yeah.
think
Here's,
so.
no, that's okay. I found it here. Yes.
Just
A little,
this
yeah.
one. Yeah.
Right. Looks like that. So if you prefer a ring, a watch, it doesn't matter. There's lots of different tools. We use the Garmin Vivo Smart 4 in our practice just because of what exactly you saw. It's a little bit more real time data that's a little bit simpler to read about the stress piece. So if you are stressed overnight, it's going to look orange. You're going to wake up with this body battery algorithm, which shows you like, okay, I just slept 12 hours and I'm not restored or I am restored. So a foundation of yoga, breath work, mindfulness, a real awareness of nervous system regulation, and tracking the data of your heart rate variability, your restorative sleep, your stress. This sets the foundation for step one. And the good news is doing that, and I also have seen this time and time again, as quickly as 3 months, but sometimes a year to 18 months, depending on, because you had a number of things shake you up at the same time, not just COVID. I've had people who just had nothing else, just one COVID infection, got got to see me within 2 weeks of it. And then everything else was still in place. They had their support system. They had their sense of connection. They were in nature. You also had to move and you were going through perimenopause and there was a lot of other stuff going on. So it could be just a few months, but even it is a few months for people that just have one simple COVID infection sometimes, or a year or 18 months. It doesn't matter. We don't want to put a time limit on it, but it does recover. And so now that you've been doing this consistent yoga, breath work, mindfulness practice, are you finding that your dysautonomia is improving in any way? The blood pressure, the heart rate symptoms?
It has improved. It's still not as it was, before.
Mm-hmm.
And but also because I'm pacing, so
Yeah.
I really adapt my day, my week, even my month. So if I know that I have an engagement or something, I will have ton of rest before and after. And I'm fortunate, to have to do my own schedule, so I can also schedule my day in function, and it makes a big difference. So I think I'm more aware about what I can do, or if I maybe would need more rest and so on. And so it helps, but still, if I overdo, physically or mentally, I know that I will have some bad days after. And I just wanted to add also something about the device, because when I went, for a walk with my husband, and I told him, okay, I cannot anymore. I'm so tired. And say, no, we did nothing now. It's, and he couldn't understand. And I showed him, the data and, the battery level, HRV and so on. I said, oh, wow. And at that time, having the data, seeing that, he could understand. And then he was much more, okay, we will take a break, or how do you feel? And so because that's like endometriosis, it's invisible.
Yeah, that's so valuable to share. In fact, just yesterday, the Harvard Business Review came out with an entire guide, and we'll make sure we link it to this show notes, about supporting people in the workplace with long COVID because of exactly that. You can look perfectly normal when you have kind of set your life up to manage your schedule, kind of stay in your energy level envelope, very slowly progress your exercise only as your body heals, not to heal your body. I think that's kind of a lot of times, especially in the world of physical therapy and medicine, like exercise is part of the healing. But in this case, it's the opposite. As you heal, you rest enough, you nourish enough, you get all the right treatments, which we'll get into, then you have more capacity to even walk, not even like more exercise, to even walk, even do yoga, even stand up and take a shower, like some of the basics, and work, especially if your work is physical. But even if you have a sedentary job, that tool can be very valuable because it's the stress of everything: eating, digesting, getting dressed, putting makeup on, doing something on a computer, which is cognitive work, any kind of emotional perturbation. So if your kid was having a meltdown in the morning, that could mess up your energy envelope. And so I really love that tip, that if someone's living with someone or has a manager or a child or anyone in their life who's really not understanding it, because some days you are normal, you're functioning normal, you look normal. But having that data is a really valuable way to be like, but inside, this is all the stuff I'm managing.
Yeah, it's so valuable.
Yeah, really good. Well, and I'm glad he was able to hear that too, because sometimes
Yeah.
there's even resistance with that. All right. So step one is nervous system regulation. I can't overstate how important that is, and how patient someone with long COVID and their caregivers and their employers and their friends and their partners are going to have to be when it comes to the amount of time, even for really skilled practitioners who have a baseline of doing this for a decade or more. It can take 3, 6, 12, 18 months easily to start getting that nervous system regulation back in balance, so that sleep is more restorative. Day to day, we're not just using energy trying to maintain nervous system regulation. All right. Then step 2 of our process is to focus on our client's goals. So now where we stand, so you're, a year and a half outside of your COVID infection that kind of knocked you off kilter. What would you say? And this is important to reassess every 6 months or so because things progress and improve. So, what would you say your vision and goals are now for your own health? What are some of your priorities, say we're now in May, so say between now and the end of this year?
It's to, yeah, just maintain the basis, but also to regain, this kind of energy,
Mm,
because still it's not, as I would like to be. And so I can really engage in life, travel to visit, but also, for my business and my work. So to do the projects that I would like to implement, and I didn't feel I have, the energy to do that, and so I'd like to, regain my energy, and also to prevent the risk related to endometriosis, long COVID, and perimenopause.
mm.
Um, so because I know that, yeah, in menopause, I could have some, you know, not complication, but
Like
um, yes,
exacerbation. Yeah.
exactly. So that's why I really like to also maybe optimize, all the things, but really also that's this energy level, physical and cognitive energy level, I would say.
Yeah. So that's super valuable because we want to keep that energy goal attached
Mm.
to your life goal, which is, okay, maybe we even define further. You can sit with your husband, you can work on this on your own, like 2 or 3 particular trips a year. Or you want to make sure by, this time next year or by October of this year, whatever the date is, that you launch your practitioner training for yoga and endometriosis, whatever the projects are that are priority. Because one of the things that can be really valuable about for someone living with a kind of chronic illness constellation like this, especially around the time of perimenopause, menopause, is that the energy deficiency is one piece of the puzzle that we want to work on physically. And we absolutely can do that. And from a life standpoint, you're here now and we don't want to waste it, right? So I'll give you an example. So 2 weeks ago or so, I went on a girls trip to New York City for my birthday. And we were walking like literally 20,000 steps, 11 miles, 13 miles. And I was there for 2.5 days, roughly 3 days. And I knew it was going to be a lot of walking. And I've been working on walking for a long, long time. Always, some days are somewhat better than others. It depends on the weather. There's all these factors, right?
Mm.
Um, and so I designed that trip so that no matter what, energy, intolerance, whatever, I could attend it. It was one of my key goals. Like I was visioning, even when I was like laying in bed,
Mm.
4 years ago, that I would be able to walk around a city. It's one of my favorite things to do, just and enjoy, stopping at a cup of tea, walk in Central Park, if I'm in Paris, look in all the little boutiques, whatever. I wanted to be able to walk around a city. It was a really big goal. And to do it with my friends was even better. So, one, you're going to have to connect with your support network to make sure that they're comfortable with, how to support you and you to support them and everyone has a good time. And then you also might have to plan, as you were talking about before, a couple days of rest before, a couple days of rest after. We'll talk about some of the treatments to really kind of support the mitochondria
Mm.
physically. But I think it's two things that have to be held gently together. One is we absolutely want to be working on optimizing your health. And two, at the same time, we don't want to be limiting the key priorities of your life. We want to be doing them and kind of balancing that with the rest and support that you need, ideally. And it may limit, like maybe 5 years ago, you and your husband could travel once a month somewhere all around Asia. You could just like show up. You didn't need to think about where you were going to eat or where you were going to sleep. You could just figure it out. Now there's going to be some planning. You might have to do it 3 times a year or twice a year, not every month. But I think that connection to like the priorities of your life is very important. What do you think about that?
It is. It really is.
Absolutely. So, with any complex chronic illness, as you're saying, and with the perimenopause menopause transition, what we need to do, so there is some value in certain cases to ruling out major problems. Blood
Mm.
clots, let's say you have endometriosis growing on a nerve or in your lung or on your diaphragm. Like there are times where there are more urgent kind of Western medicine things that need to be looked at and ruled out. And I strongly encourage that in any case of mystery or invisible illness, no matter what the
Sure.
driver is. So I appreciate you sharing what you did there. And then, and by the way, I had the same thing. I had like a blue hand. And so
Oh.
I had an ultrasound and, no blood clot. So you never know. And I had done the same thing. It was right after a trip. I had traveled. So we're going to get into the vascular pleasures of long COVID in just a minute. But so we're ruling out serious issues, which is important to do. All right. So you have the tools to regulate your nervous system. All of our clients should have that. We should be working with every single client on that. We know your vision and goals. You have 1 or 2 key work priorities, you have 1 or 2 key life priorities, and you're steadily expanding your energy envelope, is what it's called in kind of the pacing terminology. Or there's the spoon theory. You kind of wake up in the morning with 5 spoons, how many are you going to still have by the end of the day? You've got to be mindful of that. And it can fluctuate, sometimes you got a great night of sleep. Sometimes you ate perfectly. Sometimes you didn't. Sometimes you were in a plane, whatever. So now in step 3, we gather the data. So we know from the story you've told us where you are. You're on that perimenopausal spectrum. You have low testosterone. We know your story. We know you have a history of endometriosis. We know you had when your COVID infection was and how that changed your symptoms pretty quickly. And so we can piece some things together. So moving on now, we've got the story, we've got some data points, we have some of the key areas of challenge, because the other thing about long COVID is it can look different for everyone. And so which systems are out of whack. So as you mentioned earlier, our perspective is always don't chase symptoms, optimize systems. But the symptoms can give us some clues as to which symptoms are sort of the systems are the priority. So in step 4, we start thinking in terms of recommendations. So with an underlying history of endometriosis, we know that you have some autoimmune vulnerability or immune system dysregulation vulnerability. With the long COVID, your symptoms are presenting from the cardiovascular system, from the lymph system, from the autonomic nervous system, not so much the endocrine system because your period's kind of normalized, but still a little bit of a change in your cycle that we want to keep in our back pocket. And then certainly the energy and metabolic and mitochondrial systems for sure. And then with perimenopause on top of that, you do have some endocrine markers of low testosterone, which sometimes comes from that metabolic perturbation of blood sugar dysregulation and inability to strength train and kind of build muscle, which helps promote healthier testosterone levels and kind of vice versa. So it's a little bit of a downward spiral, which is related to your energy limitations. So, given your goals, where I would want to begin, and also just given the physiology, is one, you're already doing autonomic nervous system regulation. That's key. That has to be a foundational piece. 2 is the energy window of pacing. So, if you haven't heard of pacing, and I know you have, but for our listeners, pacing is where you're aware of how much cognitive work, how much emotional stress you can take, how much walking you can do, how much exercise you can do before your symptoms get worse. And it's tricky because this is something that people have to learn individually, because often that symptom exacerbation or that fatigue is delayed by 12 to 24 hours. So you might do a workout, you feel good, you have a busy day of work, and then like a day or so later, or even the next morning, you wake up and you're like, oh, I was kind of hit by a truck there. Yeah, there's like what people call the crash. Like you just like are like, oh, okay. So, or like the system just fails. Like if you don't sort of put all the right pieces in place, there hits a point where the system kind of fails. And I had this experience when I was on that New York trip. I felt really good 90% of the time. I had everything in place. But the second day we were there, I walked literally 20,000 steps. And then we went to dinner and I ate some bread that had some gluten in it, which is pretty unusual for me. And on the walk home from that restaurant, it was like my brain failed. Like my cognitive system failed. I could not, I had no alcohol, nothing like that. And I could not navigate us home. I felt drunk. So PESE or PEM, post-exertional symptom exacerbation, post-exertional malaise, can come from putting too many stressors on the system to a point of sort of something failing. And that could be, eating a suboptimal nutrition plan. That can be exercising too much. That can be doing too much cognitive work. That can be not getting enough sleep. That can be time zone change. That can be an emotional thing. And I don't want to put any guilt on anyone. Look, I don't regret whatsoever the day I had that day. My brain stopped functioning for a little while. I went to bed and I was fine the next day. But I'm also 4 years out of this. It might have taken me out, 2, 3
Mhm.
days in the past. Again, still probably worth it, right? That's why we have to always connect to our goals. And sometimes we can't control these things. So you didn't want to move to Asia, and yet that was happening in your life for other reasons. You maybe don't want to live in a hot place. That's happening. So I think we have to be careful for anyone listening, especially practitioners. Patients are doing their very best, and we have to keep celebrating the fact that they're working on this and they're living their lives in the most joyful and connected ways possible.
Yeah, and that's a good point because, having this joy and also fun, and that's also a key component. And I think it's part also of all this ecosystem. And sometimes, when you deal with that every day, we tend to maybe forget that. And so bringing, that joy and things that brings joy. So it's so supportive also. And
It's so true. It's also part of the healing, even if there's a temporary shakeup in the energy envelope, if you will. Thank you so much to Aurelie for sharing her really vulnerable experience with struggling with an underlying endometriosis condition and then it being more complicated by her transition into perimenopause and also struggling with long COVID. What a really important story. I hope you downloaded this episode and are taking notes. So, take some notes about how we can pull in and integrate someone's story and experience where they can tell us so much about what's going on. And then layer on top of that some of the objective measures we can use, some wearable measures, some wearable data we can collect, some functional lab testing that we can collect and start to get a kind of an overview of what you think is going on in this case. And then we'll meet again next week and talk about some of the next step solutions that Aurelie and I discussed during our conversation and see if you agree, see if you're on the same page, see if you learned something, see if you have some other ideas. Absolutely share them with us. So I look forward to coming back and sharing more of this case with you next week in part 2. See you then.